Business leaders know the future is already here. The economy is shifting. Non-humans are entering the workforce. Nothing feels certain. SHRM understands those evolving challenges, both in the workplace and the wider world. In this podcast, we'll bring together authors, researchers, executives, and non-traditional experts to help you take on the challenges others haven't yet considered. Because you don't need to be a futurist, you need actionable insights now. You need to be a Tomorrowist. I'm Jerry Wan. Welcome to Tomorrowist, where we explore the trends shaping the future of work. This week, we're diving into a challenge that's looming for all organizations, the coming wave of retirements. What happens when decades of experience, leadership, and knowledge walk out the door? And how can employers prepare now to ensure business continuity and support generations of talent? Here to share what retirement readiness really looks like is Peter Cappelli, Professor of Management at the Wharton School and Director of Wharton Center for Human Resources. Peter, welcome to Tomorrowist.
Thank you, Jerry.
You've written extensively about workforce management, talent development. How prepared are most organizations for the coming wave of retirements? And where do you see the biggest gaps?
Well, I'd say they're not thinking about it. And I think that's been true for a while. I mean, there's so many other things going on. You know, a lot of management issues just get pushed to the side. You know, I think we could just go down the list of things that are of concern. There's concerns to the employees themselves, but from the perspective of the employer, it's knowledge transition that's generally the biggest issues. And after that, it's probably succession related issues, although I'm not sure that has gotten so much attention that companies are so concerned about that. But knowledge retention, probably the big one then.
And what are the biggest consequences of not paying attention to it and therefore losing experience employees either to retirement or to, other factors of leaving the workforce?
You know, years ago, I used to take my MBA students on a really dangerous field trip. We used to go visit companies when they made things, including U.S. Steel. And we went to a integrated steel works at Fairless Hills, Pennsylvania, long since closed. And in a steel mill where they're making steel, I mean, it's a big production. And these huge vats, they literally blast them open with a stick of dynamite, blows the ceramic seal, out comes this molten steel. It's so hot that you can't be within 100 or 200 feet of it without getting burned. The thing that I thought was most interesting there, and you're probably wondering how this relates to our topics, is that they told me they had just had an early retirement program and that the average age of their steel makers had fallen from 35 years to 25 years. And, you know, you thought, okay, well, what difference would that make? They said it increased their costs of making steel by 10%. So the age experience gap from 25 years making something to 35 years, you would think, well, how much more could you learn in another 10 years of doing this? But apparently enough that it really made a difference. And that's the consequence, right? Is that there's all kinds of things that older employees know that younger ones don't. If you substitute experience for age, because they're extremely correlated, then it all makes sense. If we say age, it sounds pejorative, but if you say experience, it sounds positive, right? So that's the question, right? And I think in addition to simply experience, that example was all people doing the same job. But if you have people who are doing different jobs, then you have the problem of succession as part of that. You've got somebody who's leaving an entire job. And it's not just that the people behind them are doing exactly the same thing. So the knowledge transfer there becomes hugely important.
Thanks for that. I think, it's such a fascinating topic now with technology. And you gave the example of a steel mill, but, most office jobs or corporate jobs are being impacted by the advancement and the quick advancement of AI, how that replaces certain skills or tasks. And so, knowledge transfer is something that we talk about a lot, but it's rarely done. I think there's good intent there, but, most organizations can do better. What are some effective strategies organizations can implement from your research and your knowledge to preserve institutional knowledge before it's too late and they're scrambling to do it in reverse?
Yeah, so I forgot early on to plug the book I wrote on this a while ago called Managing the Older Worker. It's been a while. And I am certainly an older worker now. Maybe I could just tell you another historical story about this, and this is about mandatory retirement, which was invented at Sears Roebuck in the 1930s. And the reason it was invented was because Sears discovered that the senior people were not helping the junior people learn anything. And the reason is they thought the junior people were going to take their jobs. So what Sears did is it created mandatory retirement and says, look, these people are going to take your jobs, and it's going to be in a very clear timeline. So you might as well help them, and maybe they'll be grateful for you, or they should be. And so I think that's the big thing. If you can imagine that it's coming, you could do something about it. If you ignore it, you can't. My sense is that we've gotten kind of dumber post-COVID. So if you went back to 2019, a lot of these ideas were very much kind of on the agenda on all kinds of things. How do we manage these transitions so knowledge gets transferred? And a lot of that was, about just buddying people up, for example, making it a priority and telling the junior people, look, this person here is going to be retiring, or they're just, experienced. Would you go talk to them and hang out together? And if you make it something that doesn't have to be mandated, but desirable by the company, then it's kind of going to happen. But if you don't, neither party really thinks it's a big priority. Young people don't know what they don't know, and older people kind of know it, but they don't necessarily feel like taking on an extra task with somebody who doesn't want to do it, right? So it doesn't take a lot to move this along, but somebody at the top has to say, hey, it's important. We need to do something about this.
Let's take a quick pivot into a cousin of knowledge transfer, which is succession planning. And obviously, we can't talk about managing an older workforce or the transitions without talking about succession planning. Most organizations, again, don't do it well. In a SHRM survey recently, said only 21% of HR professionals said that their organizations even had a formal succession plan. What does that look like in practice? And I want to also note, we live in a world where, particularly for publicly traded companies, the incentives for management and executives is more short-term than it used to be. And so how do you balance succession planning, what seems like a long-term priority, and balance that with the ways that people are judged, their KPIs, and the ways that they're, at the end of the day, compensated for their decision-making?
Well, I think it's important to draw some distinctions just with respect to terms, right? So if we think about developing talent internally, that's something that all organizations should be doing. That means preparing people as well for bigger jobs. That's something that all organizations ought to be doing. Promoting from within is also something that has declined a lot, frankly. And then after that, we've got the issue of succession planning. Succession planning means trying to predict who will be in which job and pick them in advance. I don't think all organizations need to do succession planning, but preparedness makes sense. That is, knowing how we're going to execute this, particularly at the very top level of the company. And preparing people for bigger jobs is something we should all be doing, right? The problem with succession planning is that succession planning in the sense of let's pick today the leader who will be in this job in 4 years, is that you're making two bets. And the first bet is that the description of the job that you've got in mind now will still be there in 4 years. We can predict accurately what we will need today. That doesn't work all that well. And the second is that the person we pick today will grow into that role adequately, still be here in 4 years. And both have to be true at the same time or the thing doesn't work, right? So if you think the odds are 50% that we could do a good job predicting today what the skills will be, requirements, and 50% that we could pick somebody who will still be here and be able to grow into that, right? Then the odds that the succession plan is going to work are 0.5 times 0.5. So it's a 1 in 4 chance. And then the question is, do we really want to bet like that? And I think for most organizations, the answer is probably no. And you could do succession at closer to the end, but you should have a plan in place as to here's how we're going to do it. And you should have people who are prepared within reasonably short order to step into a role like that. But, picking the person in advance is not something that you necessarily have to do. But I think the consequence of being in a world where things are uncertain, much more uncertain than they were before, and that where outside candidates are something that most organizations look at routinely, certainly for the very top job, CEO job, but you could do succession all the way down. It just makes less sense to try to do this far in advance, to try to pick the people, far in advance as well. But, shortening the period of time. So don't make succession planning a 4-year exercise, but, maybe a 1-year exercise, but especially having a pool of people, small pool, who we think could do the job makes perfect sense and something we ought to be doing.
In both terms of succession planning and knowledge transfer, we use the example of the steel mill, which are the actual knowledge bank of the workers. We also have talked about sort of at the executive ranks. How should organizational leaders think about the balance of planning for both ends? Because you want the institutional knowledge of how to run the business, but there's value in succession planning and knowledge transfer of how the actual entity is run. How should we think about that?
I think at the lower end, it is in many ways easier to do because there's less, the stakes are lower, right? For one thing, we know we're going to need a lot of, let's say, first line supervisors or a lot of master mechanics. It's not also quite a life and generational changing event as it is to become the CEO of a big company. So the stakes are lower, easier to do. And, that is a kind of low impact exercise. Let's just get these guys together and pair them up and do something formal so that they know that this is important for us to do. That's, pretty straightforward. And because they're working similarly on the same kind of things, it's easier to do it on the ground, face to face, day to day. At the more senior level, it's a higher stakes exercise. And we're talking about generally succession into a new job, which is even harder exercise to do. And it's also one, frankly, where the person at the top doesn't always love it. CEOs often resist having a succession plan. Steve Jobs, famously, right? But, Elon Musk, I'm sure, has no successor and succession plan in mind. So it's a much harder exercise to do at the top. And the knowledge sharing part also gets trickier. So the punchline of that is you really should be doing it at the lower levels because it's easy to do. People generally like it. The senior people like to pass on what they know to the junior people. And the junior people soon figure out the older people know something and they're kind of grateful for it. One thing we should also talk about, but I won't, just make sure we get to it at some point, is post-retirement connections, right? That we can stay in touch with people afterwards as well. So we might talk about that.
We talked about generations, and I think that's been an ongoing hot topic, right? How different generations work, how they show up to work, how they think about work, tenure, and all these things. And, much has been said and written about generalizations of different generations on how they work. And, the young folks look at the old folks saying, you don't know what you're doing. The old folks look at younger folks saying, you guys don't know what you're doing. How do we balance the need as organizational leaders to develop young talent, build that pipeline, retaining older workers who have institutional knowledge and wisdom based on their experience, and to build a cohesive system where there's not as much judgment, but there's, humility and openness to learn so that organizations can pass on these things effectively?
Well, this is a topic where the disconnect between practice and knowledge, and by knowledge, I mean what we really know, is just enormous. So one of the most important, but absolutely least read documents in modern times is a report done by the National Academy of Sciences, published 3 years ago, on generational differences. And this was a report put together by leading demographers in the US. And I was not part of it. I did testify a tiny bit, one part of it. And their conclusion is that all these generational stories are fake. There's no evidence for any of them. There's no Gen X, there's no Gen Y, there's no Gen Z. It's entirely cooked up by consultants who are making relatively simple mistakes. And the mistake they're making mainly is confusing what are known as age effects. Age effects mean as people get older, their needs change and their interests change in quite predictable ways. If you think about what your focus was when you were right out of college, it's quite different than it is maybe 10 years later if you have a family and a mortgage and that sort of stuff. Quite predictable what happens there. So they're seeing those kind of changes and they're saying, they're generational differences, right? And if you're paying any attention to this literature over the last 20 years, the complaints about whatever the new generation is, X, Y, Z, Q, R, S, T, whatever it is, X1 prime, they're always the same. They're always about people who are impatient, and they're always about people who have real needs, social needs, all that sort of stuff. So they're just attributes of younger people, really. The good news for that, though, is the second thing that we know, which has not translated into practice, is that if you put younger people together, they don't necessarily get along because they're competing for the same stuff. If you put older people together, they don't necessarily get along because they're competing for the same stuff. If you mix them up, they actually get along better. And the reason is because they're not competing for the same stuff. The older people look at the younger people and say, they just really don't know anything. We need to help them. And the younger people look at the older people and say, they just can't do anything. We need to help them. So they actually work together better. So I don't think there's anything really to fear from that. It's a real opportunity. There is one problem, which I think is relatively new, and it's what my book was really about. It's called Managing the Older Worker, is that we are much more likely now to get younger supervisors managing older subordinates. And the reason for that is many people want to come back from retirement and keep working. And there's some evidence that at least in some roles, you can get to the top faster now. So you could very well have a younger boss managing an older subordinate. And that can be a little tricky. I would say the trickiest part on that is with the supervisor. And what they say, they don't always say it out loud, is this person looks like my mom. I can't imagine bossing her around, And so they're afraid to do it, partly for that reason and partly because they think, this person has been doing this for 40 years. I can't, what can I tell them, right? And I think, the latter is the problem because as a good supervisor, as we know, your job is not to dictate to the experts below you. You don't have to be better at what they're doing than they are. And that's not your role anyway, right? Your role is to kind of, manage the interface and manage the projects and not do their work for them. So I'd say that's the real likely hang up, is that we see a lot of discrimination against older workers, some of it because younger supervisors are reluctant to hire them. And you might say that's discrimination. You might say that's discomfort, but it's largely misplaced. The older workers, if they're applying for the job and they know there's a younger supervisor, they kind of know what they're getting into. It is also probably true, though, that many things that work well with younger employees don't work quite so well with older ones. For sure, do this because I said so doesn't work very well with somebody who's done it longer than you have. Also, carrots and sticks don't work quite so well, like we're going to fire you. Yeah, well, I'm 67, it's not such a big deal, right? So I think you do have to manage differently, but I think we would agree that the way you manage older workers is the way you should be managing everybody, right? And that is to try to work with them and not try to micromanage them and boss them around, and engage what they know, right? So the military has been actually very good at this. Because we probably know that if you look at the service academies, they release 22-year-old second lieutenants and they put them in charge of 45-year-old sergeants, right? And the sergeants know a lot of stuff. And the smart lieutenants embrace that, right? So I have a friend here who was a chief master sergeant, and, really decades of experience. And he said when he would get a second lieutenant, 22-year-old, he would say to them, sir, you can do anything you'd like. Just ask me first. Just engage me a little bit on this, right?
I think the example that we often think about, and it is, shared on the internet quite a bit, is in that example, Peter, when a young new attorney joins a firm and how they treat the paralegal who may have been there for 3 decades, and understanding that the paralegal actually has more institutional knowledge, they have organizational know-how, but also soft power in the organization, and how that young attorney says, I am the attorney, you're the paralegal, this is the power structure. But understanding that nuance, I think, is critical for mutual success.
Yeah.
And it's joked about on the internet, right? Like, oh no, like this guy doesn't know what he or she is doing, and understand that.
Hmm.
One thing that I think is true, whether it is a diversity in generation, but the workforce in America is and will continue to get more diverse based on broad demographics. There are gender differences of expectation. There are cultural differences. You mentioned the military. In some cultures, there is definitely age-based hierarchy and respect, and even the ways that we use words that can change that dynamic. Knowing that that is the future of more diversity and a more diverse workforce, how can organizational leaders both train and to ready their leaders and their people so that we can both get through the transitions of not only retirement but also general belonging in the workplace?
Yeah. So the I think it's the Army has a model about this, and apologies to the Army, it might actually be the Marine. They have a very explicit model about if you are an officer, the second lieutenant, let's say, about how to assess everybody you're going to deal with before you deal with them. And it is sort of going down a list of things that might matter. Demography is not destiny. Because you're of a particular age or particular gender, that doesn't define and predict with great certainty how you're going to behave, but it's something that you might put in the back of your mind, right? And I think that sounds like pretty good advice in general, just awareness of who are we dealing with here. You don't have to act on it. You want to sort of start out the same way with everybody. But, the Army motto that no battle plan survives first contact with the enemy, that you got to adjust pretty quickly. And that if you have in the back of your mind these possible factors that might be going on, you can adjust more quickly. So I think that's kind of the heart of it, right? Is to prepare people with some understanding of the person that they're about to deal with, and not make it stereotypes, but to keep it in the back of your mind as a way to adjust the way your relationship is going if you don't think it's going perfectly.
You mentioned earlier in the conversation the example of Sears with forced retirement. We've also talked about sort of the dangers of that with the U.S. Steel example of institutional knowledge going out and the cost ultimately going up to produce the same
Yep.
unit. Um, we have heard conversations that we have seen, with respect to the federal government as of late, with offers to leave earlier, the impact that it has had on uh, a lot of different things, and concerns being shared of we just don't have enough people, and even if we were to replace them with younger people, just the skill level, and we're seeing that with even agencies like the FAA in the last few weeks, and the real impacts that can have based on not only the decrease of bodies but what's in their brains. How do we balance that? Because we've also seen businesses prioritize balancing their workforce to plan better for their financial future in terms of pensions and how to right size things. How should organization leaders balance that and think about what is the right thing to do both in the short and the long term?
Yeah. Well, I think they're just making a lot of mistakes, frankly. And the mistakes that they're making are just not paying attention to this. There's a kind of prevailing view that layoffs are pretty obviously what you should do, and cut early and cut often. And, the evidence on that is exactly the opposite, that companies that can delay layoffs the longest end up in better situation because they capture the rebound when things pick back up, at least in most of the recessions we've had so far. Now, if you're a company that's in bankruptcy or something, it's obviously a different sort of story. But I think there's a view that getting rid of people is not a big problem. And replacing them is not a big issue either. They see it as kind of a plus. You can restructure by getting new people in. My colleague at Wharton, Matthew Bidwell, did a lovely study, and I wish he had $1 for every time I mention it, but here's the study he did, looking at directors in big corporations, banks in particular, and comparing people who were promoted from within versus people who were hired from the outside to fill those vacancies. And he found that the people who were hired from the outside, it took them 3 years to achieve the same performance level as people promoted from within. And it took the people promoted from within 7 years to make as much pay as the people hired from the outside. So I think the view that is widely held, I think, particularly in the investment world, but in much of the corporate world, is that, laying off or replacing people, pretty simple, just do it, right? And I think we don't understand, well, it's not appreciated at the senior level how long it takes for people to understand the organization and to get really good and proficient at their jobs. It's a really costly thing to do. So don't churn them is the big point here. I had an interesting conversation with a union leader recently who had gone into a company, manufacturing company, where they represented the employees. And he saw on every machine there was a $ with a big number on it. And he said, "What's this about?" And the management said, "We want every employee to know how expensive these tools are that they're working with." He said, "Okay." So they went outside and they got name tags for everybody. And they wrote $ with big numbers on all of them, and they put them on the employee's chest. He said, "We want the managers to understand how expensive each of these employees are and how valuable they are." And it literally would change things if they understood that. But I think it doesn't percolate through at the top, right? So I think that's an awareness issue.
As we wrap here, we talked about retirement and how even that term or that idea is changing, evolving. People are staying in the workforce longer. People are living longer in general. The options to do work, and we'll put work in big, giant air quotes here, non-traditional work, whether that's in the creator economy or making a living online or doing something creative, also lengthens what people would consider their window of work. You also mentioned relying on technically retired folks to come and advise and to help businesses grow or to consult from the external, although they may not register on a survey of fully employed workforce. How does that change, or how do you see that changing in the next few years? And again, how can organizations take advantage of these really smart, knowledgeable, wise folks who are available and are willing to, help organizations grow?
Yeah, well, it's a really simple thing to do. And interestingly, I would say 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it was a really popular idea. And a lot of organizations had alumni clubs to stay engaged with these folks. A lot of them had quite explicit relationships with their retirees to bring them back for projects and assignments. And it was quite formal stuff, right? You could do it informally, though. All it takes is, being able to reach out to the people who have retired recently, and they're really, really useful, right? I mean, if you've never dealt with a client before and the person who managed this account has retired, and if you could get 10 minutes of their time, you could learn a lot, right? So just being able to maintain those connections is not that hard to do, but it is, people just don't think about it unless somebody higher up in the company says, "Hey, this is an important thing to do, and we want you to do it," right? It's probably all that we really have to do. It wouldn't take much to formalize it either, small budgets to take the people out to lunch or something, or have a quarterly check-in or annual check-in or something. Because what you really want is real-time conversations. I don't need you for a while. You're the boss who retired, but then in 2 months, wow, I really do. You just need to have that line exist so that you can reach out. Generally, the retired people are delighted to have somebody reconnect and ask them for help, So it's an easy thing to do. It doesn't require much time and energy to put in place. But again, everything's about top management attention, right? Whether they'll say important to do.
Yeah, I don't think it's just for retirees. I think there are, most schools do it well, right? They set up alumni associations. Obviously, there's a vested financial interest to solicit donations and engagement down the line. Few companies do it well. Notably, some consulting companies invest heavily in their alumni network. And those actually also invest heavily in engaging with non-retiree exit folks, right? So people who leave earlier because they know that the relationships, or maybe they could go and become a client of theirs at some point. And so, I think you bring up a fascinating point. It is probably a extremely high ROI activity. And even without the financial components of it, it's just a feel good thing to do to take care of the people that, have taken care of you.
Yeah, and just to put a point on that, about 15 years ago, there were actually companies that were in the business of helping clients set up these alumni network. And, everybody thought it was a great idea. And then for some reason, a lot of these things just faded away. Too bad. Maybe they'll come back now. Maybe we will make this happen, Jerry.
If you're listening, whoever's listening, and you got in your smart MBA perhaps that just graduated from Wharton, and one of Peter's students, this is a good idea to take and run with. Peter, as we wrap here, what is the one thing that organizations can do tomorrow to ensure that they're not caught unprepared for a surge of retirement, and to make sure that they can handle their transitions, their knowledge transfer, succession plans, and all the other things that happen with older workers well?
Well, if you're somebody at or near the top, just call your CHRO and say, I want to have a longer conversation laying these things out. We want to talk about knowledge. Here's the general problem. It's knowledge transfer and succession of talent, not just a set of boxes and moving people around. How do we do it? Right. And my guess is your chief human resource officer would be delighted to have that. Generally, they're waiting for the CEO to signal something. And then, a lot of it's common sense, and open it up to other people, and you'll get all the good ideas coming out on how to do it. But again, it just takes the CEO to say, let's talk about this.
I'll add one more thing, which is to go read Peter's book, Managing the Older Workforce, to help organizational leaders be better prepared for tomorrow. Peter, Professor Cappelli, thank you so much for joining us, Professor of Management at the Wharton School. Wonderful conversation about how organizational leaders, and us, just even the workforce, can be best prepared for the transitions that are happening in the workplace, the older workforce, and then how we can all benefit from that. Peter, thank you so much for joining us on Tomorrowist, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
SHRM.